I'd like to welcome you to Ready23's focus session on cybersecurity. It should not be lost on any of us that the wonderful things that communications are doing for public safety professionals, the ability to detect needs for a public safety response, identify where that need is, what I need to dispatch, and get that dispatch done effectively, and then to follow up and provide support to units on the scene while we ultimately then address and close out the issue, is made much better from the increased functionality, the increased kinds of communications that we have. And we're very fortunate to have an august panel with us, and I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves in their first remarks, and I'll do that shortly. And I'd like to get right into it with our first question is talk about the threat environment. So Patty, if you could outline for us, what is the current threat environment? What has changed in recent years? What will likely change in the years going forward? Talk to us about the malicious actors out there. Patty, over to you.
Thank you very much. And what an unhappy subject to talk about. So my name is Paddy McGuinness, and I'm a former British national security official, latterly as National Security Advisor to two British Prime Ministers, where I oversaw national resilience, but also the National Cybersecurity Programme, and also some aspects of offensive cyber in government. For the last 5 years, I've been supporting listed companies mainly as they deal with technology risk. And that means everything from dealing with a regulatory environment through to supporting them through crises. And you'll hear in what I say now, that balance between what it feels like to the state, which you're part of, and what it feels like as an individual entity trying to deal with it, and the reality when these events happen to you or you have a near miss. So David, let's be clear, we face high levels of criminal threat. And we face that, I think, in every jurisdiction, and I do this globally. You face it in China. Chinese business face it from different sources than those we face. But in the United States, and where I'm talking to you from, the United Kingdom, my word, there is a high level of threat. And there's a large industrial effort, mainly by Russian language attackers, to get into vulnerable systems indiscriminately and to extort money. And that is the principal threat we face at the moment. I'll come back to that in a second. I think it's really important to recognize that that is the ambient threat, but it's not the complete threat, because when I oversaw aspects of the offensive cyber programs in the UK, and in particular the spend, there were techniques we'd use, and we've talked about them publicly against terrorist groups and the like. There are techniques that were available for tactical use, and frankly, there was strategic capability against known adversaries. And we have seen the first category of those used by nation states. We've seen a little bit of the second, particularly around Ukraine, although that's been quite effectively defended. And we're seeing it at the moment, incidentally, in Israel and the conflict that it faces. But we haven't seen the third category. And therefore, when we talk about threat, we need to recognize both the immediate and the commodity one that faces us, but also the fact that we are part of critical national infrastructure as emergency service providers in part of the network that provides that. And so we need to have a little bit of our mind ready to deal with the more extreme events. And we can come back with that without becoming panicked or distracted by that. Now, there's been, as we all, I think, know, there's been a definite shift from what was termed hacking to much more socially engineered attacks, phishing, malicious links and the like, but also attacks on networks because of the remote working that so many organizations have had to do. And we see a great deal of that. I'm afraid to say that vulnerability is not necessarily the best indicator of whether or not you'll be attacked. I mean, definitely you don't want to be vulnerable, but you can be really quite secure. But if you have the misfortune to have a particular kind of software or element of software in your supply chain, which becomes vulnerable, even if you're otherwise very, very secure, you'll find yourself in difficulty. And of course, we've seen that with Move IT and various other relatively small applications, which have created
For high-end
vulnerability.
organizations, right? For the U.S. Defense Department is vulnerable to that kind of supply chain attack. So you just can't assume that you're ever going to be able to eradicate it all.
I think it's also important to recognize that quite a lot of this attack from criminal groups is indiscriminate. And they often don't know what they when the people who sell access, which is the way it works, people sell access to a network, and then people sell the malware, and then groups make use of those two commodities to attack your network and extort from you. And there'll be other components to it. And this is this is like startup scale ups in business. These are relatively large, tens, hundreds of people working for them. Some of them have HR departments. We're dealing with proper organizations that are coming at us. When they often don't know what they've attacked, and they often don't understand the data they've taken, and they do a whole multiple of things, but their purpose is to extort. Now we have to be ready for these, and so I think a critical aspect as we think about this is that there is a high probability that some of the people listening today or watching today will have either near-miss events where it almost happens to them, or will have these events, or indeed perhaps have experienced and learned from them. And they are coruscating. I mean, they really are very, very difficult to deal with. Now, I think it's important to recognize that these tend to attack away from the cloud. And because cloud attacks are really quite complex. And if you're on AWS, on Azure, on Google, whatever your cloud provider, you've got a kind of 600-pound gorilla sat behind you who's thinking about what's going on within the cloud. And that's quite helpful if you're dealing with commodity attacks. So what's quite interesting about the cloud is it's on the cloud, you see the really high-end APT, as they call them, advanced persistent threat attacks. And I've seen a number of those in my commercial practice, where you see APT-10, the Chinese, but also some of the Russian groups, all with the name Bear involved in them. You'll hear about them. You see them active in the cloud. People will come at you by whatever means they can get in. And I'm afraid to say you have to be prepared for that. Now, I'm going to shut up and we must move on. So I've given us a pretty stark account of what is a high level of threat. If you are attacked by the state, by a hostile state, you're in a much better position, I'd argue, than if you're attacked by a commodity criminal attacker.
The cavalry is going to come. You're going to have people helping you. The cavalry is going to come in. People are going to help you with that. Yeah.
People are going to help you, as opposed to, some criminal has got in and making a bit of a mess. The way I say to people is increasingly, the really significant change there has been, I would argue, since 2019, has been that the balance of advantage between prevention, response, and recovery has shifted. And there's an enormous amount of effort put into prevention, and I'm strongly in favor of that, particularly as you look down your supply chain, or when you look at your partnerships. And I know we'll come on to that when we talk about the partnership with RapidSOS and all of its partners. That response thing is critical. Well, my word, if this audience doesn't think about how it would respond to events, we're really in trouble. Because, I mean, of all the audiences, this is the one that's going to be thinking, what do we do if? So, that recovery piece I'm really interested in, because it's the recovery piece that is least prepared for, in my experience. And I think to this audience, there's just a little bit of rebalancing between that huge focus on prevention, which of course you've got to do, pretty regulatory, you have to do it. Response where you want to keep that muscle strong, but a little thought on recovery. I think that's often the neglected area, misunderstanding of just what's required to get fully back up and running and strong.
Yeah, Patty, I love your framing of this. And, one of the things the public safety community does have is a focus on exercise, is plan and get ahead. And just as you would exercise for a 5-alarm fire, or you would exercise for a mass riot downtown, and you want to pull the SWAT team together, you need to exercise that response and recovery piece for a cyber attack. It's so important. You may not be able to afford some of the high-end protections, but you can absolutely afford to have a known good backup in emergency break glass and pull that out to restore your communications. And I love your framing. I couldn't agree more. The most likely set of attack actors would be those that are out for criminal financial gain, and they're regularly looking for the the weakness in organizations that is easily exploitable, which means you should address the easily exploitable vectors. And then I agree with you on the high-end nation-state threat actors. You should be aware of that, but your preparation probably needs to be how is the state organized? And then nationally, how do I connect with the FBI? Because you truly will have assistance if this is a nation-on-nation fight, and many localities are impacted. And then the area, though, that I do think that every community needs to think about is the terrorist potential use of cyber as part of a combined attack. And if we just look at what's going on in the Middle East now, Hamas, their very first action was to take down the communications associated with the surveillance of areas and the communications between security forces. Similarly, Israel going into the Gaza Strip, first act, take down communications. My experience in the anti-terrorism, counterterrorism world is that terrorists will layer attacks, and if they can increase the lethality of a given attack by having a cyber attack first and then executing a physical attack, they are very likely to engage in that kind of activity. So you definitely need to not just focus on ransomware at the expense of those other threat actors. I would like to shift gears and bring in Jesse Whaley. Jesse, like me, has a Defense Department background, but Jesse's currently the CISO for Amtrak. And Jesse, could you help us understand the growing universe of the useful public safety things, useful transportation things that is now adding very nice functionalities, but also expands the threat surface. Can you help us understand that a bit, and then what you're doing, what you're seeing as best practice in addressing that expanded threat surface?
Excellent. Thanks, David. And thanks, David and Patty, for kind of framing up the threat very well. That was very interesting. And I fully agree and concur. I'm seeing the same thing from my seat at Amtrak. But I'm Jesse Whaley. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Amtrak. Been there just under 5 years now. Prior to that, my entire career, as David mentioned, was in the Department of Defense. Started off actually in law enforcement. I was a CID special agent for about 10 years. So I kind of understand the value of the information that emergency responders receive and what the information that the dispatchers receive and how that translates to what actually is happening on the ground, wherever that may be. And certainly throughout my experience during that time, the information that I received before showing up on a scene somewhere was usually very differently than what I heard on the way there. But after my career in law enforcement, I moved on to a lot of technology jobs, high profile, really digital transformation jobs around the world, both in the technology infrastructure as well as in cyber, as cyber security capabilities were being built out by the DoD around the world. And then I ended up at the Pentagon as kind of my last job, where I combined a lot of cybersecurity operations around the Pentagon and the National Capital Region into a singular organization. But I do think we find ourselves in kind of interesting times right now, as both Patty and David mentioned, of really having two different war zones going on throughout the world right now, and we're seeing a cyber attack as a component to both of those those conflicts that we're seeing. And I think certainly from the nation state and the military perspective, that's going to be part of the battle plan moving forward, because due to vulnerabilities in some of our systems, it is absolutely critical to kind of gain the upper hand going into those sort of kinetic conflicts. And so that's really a lot on the nation state side. But as we start looking at what we're seeing closer to home, across various critical infrastructures. We are seeing increased targeting of critical infrastructure across the United States, and emergency services being a big part of the critical infrastructure here in the United States. And it's not just because of the threat that's evolving, and from the criminal aspect, as you mentioned, of being non-discriminatory on who they target because there's a financial gain to be had, but also from the vulnerability aspect. If I think about just all the sectors of critical infrastructure, how long ago were some of these things built, right? And there still is somewhat of an analog component to a lot of our critical infrastructure, but because a lot of our infrastructure is so dated, so outdated, and legacy, we're starting to see a lot of that being refreshed now. And even with the legacy infrastructure, there's operational and technical deficiencies that we're seeing. Let's just look at the emergency services for a second here. Even 25 years ago in the United States, we were looking at a population of, I think, around 275 million people, and today we're looking at a population around 340 million people. That's a significant volume of people that we have to support across the United States within our critical infrastructure. And I don't think the capacity of the critical infrastructure has been grown over that time. So even from an operational vulnerability perspective, when people are calling 911, sometimes they're getting a busy signal because the legacy systems just can't handle the volume of calls. And if just through normal operations, the technology that's in place today in a lot of places can't handle normal calls, that also makes it susceptible to, let's say, denial of service attack by threat actors. So being able for a threat actor to intentionally overwhelm call centers is a real risk to emergency operations and to the public safety. And I think what we're starting to see now because of that, not just because of the threat, but but also because of the vulnerabilities in the analog system, in the legacy system, not being be able to handle the capacity. We're seeing a lot of digital transformation going on throughout the country, and frankly throughout the world, as other countries begin to upgrade and update their critical infrastructure. Specifically, Amtrak. Go ahead.
Well, and that's a very important point, right? I think it will probably lead into your next question, your next point, that critical infrastructure sectors that used to be not dependent or critically dependent on communications now have a critical dependency on communications. So that capacity element not only impacts 911 and your ability to get an operator to take the call and effect the dispatch, but that capacity, if attacked, also impacts the ability of other critical infrastructure verticals to work. So positive train control comes to mind. So back to you, Jesse, to talk about some of those new areas.
No, very good. Good point, David, and thank you for that. So, Amtrak, we are the largest passenger rail provider in the United States, and we are the only rail company that travels across the entire country, across many different freight railroad infrastructure as well. So there's certainly some interoperability concerns there, and some a risk to one is kind of a risk to all, so to speak. But if I think about where even Amtrak's going in our digital transformation, we're refleeting the entire fleet. We're replacing all of the train sets to include our Acela trains. And if you've traveled along the Northeast corridor between Washington D.C. and Boston, you've seen some of those. And we're with some big infrastructure funding that the government has sent our way. And we're not just replacing the trains, which now have lots of technology on board and lots of communications requirements back to operation centers, back to control centers, and that includes, as you mentioned, David, the positive train control and other safety systems that are on board the trains. And it's absolutely critical that those operation centers, and to include emergency centers, if something were to happen, that those emergency centers have the right information at the right time to deliver the help that's needed on the ground. And even beyond the trains, we're entering $15 billion worth of construction of infrastructure next year in 2024. And a lot of tunnels that are being replaced and bridges that are remotely operated. And the difference between some of the legacy infrastructure assets that are in place today and what's being built now is they're connected. There is absolutely a need if your train's about to go into a tunnel under a river, it would be nice to know whether there's water in that tunnel, and there's sensors that can detect that, so that the appropriate actions could be taken. And kind of the broader transportation theme, I think we've experienced as a country a number of derailments over the last year or two that emergency responders just didn't have the information they needed when they arrived about what was on those trains, and how did they not just contain whatever was going on at a derailment site, but also how did they protect the public in the surrounding area. And I think as the transportation world becomes more connected, we're going to need to focus on making sure that the emergency responders have the right information. And a lot of the information, let's say that's on a freight train, it's public, right? There are public sources of where that information is available, but it's not readily made available to the right people when it is needed. So I think that there's some work to be done there as well. But under that same token, as we modernize, as we digitally transform critical infrastructure, transportation, emergency services, even water treatment facilities, and on and on and on, we're digitizing. We're connecting, the physical with the virtual world. We're connecting, assets that were fixed in one location and weren't connected to the internet. We're connecting it to the cloud, right? And so, if I think about, the security controls that maybe we put in place kind of in the legacy environment and protecting those physical assets, the same thing actually has to happen in the cloud too. So there's a good part of it, like Patty mentioned, where the cloud service providers are taking care of some of that back-end security, but that does not absolve the operator, the consumer of those cloud services from doing their own security piece, because companies like Amtrak and others, we have a responsibility when we're operating in the cloud to control what has access to our resources in those clouds. So if we just open up the access to the internet, anybody can get into it. Go ahead, David.
You can use a good tool badly, and there's so many examples of where enterprises shifted to the cloud, in part wanting to get that improved security for where your data is stored, but then didn't fully realize that the configuration within the cloud is on the enterprise. And this is very important for public safety, right? Because public safety is considering now, well, there are some advantages to moving my CAD, my computer dispatch, or some of my communications, my PSAP in a box into the cloud. Hey, great. But configuration of that is on you to make sure that you are using the cloud in a manner that has a risk tolerance level commensurate with your needed thresholds at your public safety centers.
Absolutely, David. The physical assets that we have and the virtual assets we have, I mean, I think we're seeing a rapid convergence of the two. with that, I think comes this vulnerability where there's things that people can do in the physical world, like sabotage and break things that they can find, that may not be physically secured, that could have a virtual impact on back-end systems, that could cause further disruption and degradation of services. And at the same time, we also see that there are cyber attacks, things that happen in the virtual world that can cause effects in the physical world, like disrupt or degrade, or in some cases, even destroy physical assets. And so all of these things, need to be considered and properly managed as a risk to the organization as all organizations start going through this digital transformation.
Yeah, so that's great. That's exactly where I want to go next. We see it with software-defined radios. Increasingly, what was done in a purpose-built appliance is now done in software. Sometimes that software in the cloud. Across critical infrastructure, we use the term infrastructure as code. Something that was physical before, we now have infrastructure that is code that is now attackable, and we need to be ready for that. In a number of the points that you raised, Jesse, and I'll bring Patty back in on this, where an incident occurs, a physical incident, right? You have a chemical tank that maybe derails. Immediately, there's this communication challenge of getting the word out about the emergency. But right behind that is location, right? Location is so critical to organizing an effective response and to understanding the different cross vertical critical infrastructure layers involved. But while location is well understood by public safety professionals as an element of response, it's less understood as an element of a cybersecurity program. And high-end cybersecurity programs are increasingly using this concept of zero trust. And zero trust includes, who's trying to access your network resources? What device are they accessing from? What element of information are they trying to access? Are they trying to get into your video files? Wait, that doesn't isn't an appropriate request. And where is that request coming from? So I'd like let's start with you, Patty, and then we'll bring Jesse back in. Talk about the importance of location, both for critical infrastructure, but then also location as an important pillar of a mature cybersecurity program.
Yeah, Dave, that's really helpful. And I think the point that Jesse's made about convergence is just so important, because really what you're describing is that in the zero trust environment, you'll want to know, yes, what's happening in a virtual and data sense, where is the data flowing from and to, etc. But also you're going to want to relate it to a physical site. And what I note is there'll be great variety of the richness of data that will be available in the different jurisdictions that are represented by the people joining this call. And some of them will be in a sense, highly networked, particularly urban environments with multiple sensors, and therefore a profound possibility of knowing many, many things. And others will have large expanses of, let's say, rural territory, where actually they'll have fewer data points. And so when you get a disruption, it'll be harder to form a wraparound picture quickly of what is happening, or with adequate speed of what is happening. And so I think it's important to reflect that, at the highest end, if you're in Los Angeles or New York City, you're going to have one set of characteristics going to be available to you. And if you're in rural Texas, or where I was in Pennsylvania, having ridden on the excellent trains that Jesse was referring to, which I'll now refer to as Jesse's trains, really there wasn't as much data available. But the locational data is increasingly important. And what I'd note is this, and I kind of had 4 points I wanted to leave people with at the end. I know you'll probably ask me later, so I won't say all of them now. But one of them is about the dynamic, and you've said it, David, but I want to just bring it right to the fore and give a practical point for people. So my word, we live in a technologically dynamic was stood in Davos this January with Brad Smith talking about Chat GPT. Yeah. And now look at us now and the penetration it has and the extent to which it's become shadow IT or an integral part in the way that applications are written, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a quite extraordinary pull through of a technology. And that's true throughout. There is so much additional functionality that is coming to us because the new technologies that are being pulled through, particularly in the kind of medical sector that Rapid SOS touches up against, but so do the emergency responders on this call because of the service that they provide around healthcare and other support as you describe. There is so much data in the new applications and devices that are coming through, and so many of them being written secure by design and then also secure by default, that there's an enormous advantage in that. I think one of the questions I always ask people is, and I ask it to each of the people on this call, do you have a moment in your week or in your month where you stop and you say, what is the effect of the technology change that's happening external to the technology that I own that's going to have effect on me over time? You don't want to be doing it every day and panicking, but you want a definite moment or mechanism where you look at technology opportunity and technology risk that's coming your way. And we tend to talk about the risk, but my word, there's enormous opportunity, in particular, in some of this, if you like, metadata, additional data that's generated by the new applications and devices that are being included, which have locational aspects to them. And so it's important to recognize that what we have now, and in a sense that the services we're delivering today, even at cutting edge with something like Rapid SOS, are the beginning of a journey towards a fuller relationship between the location and the virtual environment.